Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the PR consultant Alex Deane. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Well, let's take a quick look at what is on some of those front pages. The FT leads with the UN's International Court of Justice ordering Israel to take measures to prevent genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, while stopping short of calling for a full ceasefire. And that's the same at the front of The Guardian with the headline, Israel ordered by court to prevent genocide in Gaza. The Telegraph report that fears of the growing threat from Russia may lead to the return of American nuclear weapons to bases in the UK. The Eye speaks to a former head of MI6 who believes a period of good relations with China when David Cameron was Prime Minister has had the unintended consequence of increasing Chinese spy activity on British targets. The front of the Times reports on the deadly rampage through Nottingham, which left 3 people dead and families of victims wanting an inquiry into possible police failures. Camilla's smile that says the king is fine. That's on the front of the Mail as King Charles underwent a procedure for an enlarged prostate. The Express also reports on the king's surgery and his choice of hospital being the same as the Duchess of Cambridge. And the Daily Star leads with the shocking news of Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp announcing his retirement. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the program, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Zoe Williams and Alex Deane. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, so let's start with the front page of the FT, but a story that obviously is on the front pages of a lot of them. Let's look at the FT now. The headline, Israel ordered to prevent genocide. This, of course, is the ruling by the International Court of Justice. We're just hearing hasn't called for a ceasefire, but certainly sort of as calling for Israel to do a few things. Zoe, what have you made of both the ruling and the way it's being covered?
So basically, probably the FT is the most neutral presentation of it. Israel is sort of headline celebrating the fact that it hasn't been called upon for a ceasefire, but actually the ICJ ruling is significant, as the FT story relates, because it's not only called for humanitarian aid, for Israel to do everything possible to prevent genocide, which will be consequential in the future, but it's also said prevent and punish anybody committing genocide right now. So it's kind of drawing direct attention to the fact that when the ICJ rules on what counts as a genocide, the definition is quite tight, and you have to be able to prove as a court that you did people committing genocide openly and explicitly said that's what they intended to do. Now, generally speaking, that you wouldn't have that kind of evidence, but actually there have been some remarks by very senior members of the Israeli cabinet which were talked about extensively in court. So there's sort of a flag there when they say punish and prevent, that if it comes to pass, when the full ruling comes down, which could take many, many months, that they can prove that a genocide was stated by the senior members of the Knesset, then that will be really problematic for Israel.
Because, of course, this is an interim judgment, as you've just mentioned. Alex, what have you made of this series of orders to Israel by the court?
Well, there are 2 things the judgment does and 1 thing it doesn't. The 1 thing it doesn't is call for a ceasefire, which Zoe set out. The 2 things it does, on saying you mustn't commit genocide, that is, the extermination of people on national, ethnic, religious or racial grounds, Israel will shrug that off because they'll say we weren't doing that anyway. But there's no doubt it's a very clear signal about how people are perceiving Israel's actions in the situation. But the thing I think is going to be more unambiguous and attract universal support is the call to improve humanitarian situation on the ground. And many people who feel the urge after the atrocities in October to say Israel has a right to defend itself and so forth can still agree with that. They can still say, I think it's right for Israel to act, I think it's right for Israel to seek to address the Hamas threat, But improving the humanitarian situation for population in Gaza that are civilian and have nothing to do with this, that's unambiguous. And I think as people look back on this, of course, every single headline says genocide, but actually I think the call to improve the humanitarian conditions may turn out to be the most significant thing from this
Because
document.
the UN has been saying that arguably more people could die from famine if it goes to that than actual crash. Let's just pull up the front page of The Guardian so that we look at some of the other headlines. And Alex, as you say, they do all mention the word genocide. So if we look at The Guardian, Israel ordered by court to prevent genocide in Gaza. Zoe, tell us what the line is here.
And this goes larger on what Alex was just talking about, which is the delivery of aid. Now, it's incredibly significant that, you know, Israel's defence thus far about the delivery of aid has been they were delivering it, but Hamas was appropriating it. They couldn't get through because Hamas had destroyed the infrastructure. They were making all these kind of, you know, plausible deniability statements about the failure to get food and fuel and water into Gaza. That won't be possible after this, and it will put significant pressure on the international community because obviously, you know, the US has withdrawn its funding from the UNWRA today because of its suspected involvement with Hamas. But since so many of those agencies, which have been trying to get aid in and have been prevented by Israel, do have close connections with the international community, this is going to really force people to take a stronger line against the unfolding famine there.
It's worth unpicking what Zoe just mentioned about UNRWA, the UN's relief agency on the ground. And in some ways, UNRWA has been very fortunate that the judgments come out on the same day that they've announced. I don't mean to trivialise it because it's very important, but they've been very lucky in media cycle terms. These two stories have emerged on the same day because the fact that UNRWA is now conducting an internal investigation into the fact that up to a dozen of its own staff are alleged to have been involved in Hamas's attacks in October means that they are losing support from significant international donor countries.
The thing is, they are losing support, but in their place...
It's pretty serious, isn't it?
Well, of course, but in their place, other aid agencies will need access and will need funds. So I don't think that will actually change the pressure on the international community that will come from this ruling.
I agree with that, and there's one caveat, which is that in the past, Israel's been able to say part of the challenge we faced is that Egypt has kept the border closed from the south. This court order, I think, makes it clear that people will want to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and Egypt will be very well advised. If they want someone to take the blame, Egypt will be very well advised to pull away from that, and let Israel be the fall guy, because the Israeli, I don't mean excuses, but explanations about Egypt's reluctance to take part relate to the past. And if Egypt can clear the way, Israel's commitment and requirement to commit to improve the humanitarian situation is now, courtesy of this order, unambiguous.
OK, well, we had the ruling earlier today, but we have had reaction, from many people, including Rishi Sunak. Let's look at the Telegraph front page of the Telegraph, and the headline there. Number 10, attacks irony of Israel genocide ruling. Zoe, what have you made of Rishi Sunak's reaction?
I'm extremely surprised, and I think if there weren't the backdrop of the Conservative Party in disarray about their relationship vis-à-vis international law and bordered law, it would be even more surprising. Basically, Sunak has come out and called the ruling a horrific irony, and he's come out explicitly against the International Court of Justice, which is really peculiar. And you won't even, I don't think, get the US saying even a quarter as anything as trenchant as that. It's quite a stark divergence from kind of international rule of law, which I can only think he's kind of. It does not seem to be a very kind of internationally strategic thing to say. It seems to me that's much more directed to members of his own party.
Seems to me this is one of those immediate reaction missteps that you get when a story breaks, and it's not quite what you thought was going to be said, but the press release that you do relates to what you were expecting. The release from Number 10 is basically saying Israel hasn't committed genocide, but that's not what the court has said. The court has said you must ensure that genocide isn't committed. There is a difference between those two things. And it feels to me like I understand absolutely Number 10's desire to defend Israel's right to defend itself. Indeed, I believe that myself. But I do think there is a significant principal distinction between saying you have done something which is not what the court is saying, and you have an obligation, moral and legal, to ensure that this thing doesn't happen in the future.
I know evidence of conditions for a genocide.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I kind of dispute that somewhat, because the ICJ was never going to say today, they were never going to give their genocide finding today, because that was never within the timescale of this judgment. So so Sunak should have been better prepared, and he shouldn't have prepared a statement to deliver had they called genocide, which they weren't going to. And then not reacted to the facts on the ground. I mean, it's a very strong statement, what he said, don't you think?
Not only do I think, as I said, like I said, it was a misstep, and I'm a member of the Conservative Party, I wouldn't normally take a position like that, but I also think the right thing to do here is to get behind the call for improvement on humanitarian grounds, which everyone can agree with, right? And the point about this situation, you remember all those debates in the United Nations where there were discussions about where people would vote and whether you could get a majority behind any kind of resolution. The thing that unites people, the narrow path to universal agreement, is the call for humanitarian improvement of the situation on the ground. And it feels to me that's what world leaders should be rallying around, rather than quibbling over the points about the part that is actually going to not be resolved for ages.
But that's actually not what happened. When the UN called for a vote on the ceasefire, there were only 2 votes against it, and that was us and the US.
No, that was 2 votes in the Security Council, not in the General Assembly.
We'll be discussing this a lot longer, I'm sure, and it'll be interesting to see, actually, how the impact of the ruling unfolds. Let's go to another story, those horrific killings in Nottingham. So front page of the Times, and then we'll also have a quick look at page 6 of the Times with the headline there. Nottingham mother calls for inquiry into the killings, those horrific stabbings of 3 people by Valdo Kalokane, who, of course, has schizophrenia. What have you made of the way that the story is developing?
Well, at the moment, the story is developing in the sense that the failings of the police seem to be coming into the crosshairs. And I think the mother has addressed it with incredible delicacy of language. I mean, I'm really astonished that she's as restrained as she is, but when she calls for an inquiry, she says, where appropriate, lessons should be learned. Have you ever heard such restrained language from somebody so recently bereaved? She's amazing, this person. But
she did also say they've got blood on their hands, which I don't blame her for.
No, I don't blame her for that. But I think I think she does restrain herself quite well.
Sure.
But the interesting thing, I think, is that really this is a huge failure of mental health services.
Yeah.
And I think the police will eventually say, we cannot be everything. We can't be a completely crumbling mental health service as well as a police service,
And we saw pictures there of the families, of course, on the steps yesterday in court. Alex?
Yeah, the bereaved have 3 principal areas of complaint. One about the police, who, of course, missed a warrant on this guy that was outstanding some 9 months before, and then went on to miss allegations of assault against him relating to people at his workplace much more recently. So they had reason to go out and detain this guy, who'd been sectioned no fewer than 4 times, by the way, in the days before he went out and committed these horrific acts and took the lives of 3 innocent people and tried to take the lives of 3 more. But the second, so they complain about the police. In my view, that's a very hard case to rebut. The second is the mental health services case that Zoe sets out. The third concern they have is about the sentence that he got. And that we'll see what is said on appeal.
And we've got 40 seconds to talk about this other angle. New knives law, a ban in name only, page 6 of the Times. Zoe.
Well, basically, it has come out that there are loopholes in the law that mean you actually could still get the knives online. There's these zombie knives. Now, there is still plenty of forensic criminologists saying it's really unclear that a ban on specific knives is going to work, and that might account for the fact that it's just been quite haphazardly done.
Yeah, there's no reason to have knives like this other than to do serious harm to other people.
OK. Alex, Zoe, stay with us, because coming up, there are plans for American warheads to be stored at an RAF base here in the UK. We'll be looking at that story next. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Zoe Williams and Alex Deane. OK, let's go to the front page of the Telegraph. Quite a headline, US to move nuclear weapons back to the UK. So they're planning to station nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time in 15 years. And I guess this is all part of the warnings that NATO countries kind of putting out there to prepare people for some kind of possible direct confrontation with Russia.
That is correct. And RAF Lakenheath, which is down the street from where down the road from where I grew up in Suffolk, it looks to be the headquarters of a new, and I'm soon to be surrounded by protesters, I assume.
Yeah, I'll be one of them.
Nuclear capacity. And we are told by the Telegraph that these gravity bombs that they would be installing are some 3 times the strength of Little Boy, the bomb that was dropped on Japan. So these are not in the euphemisms used about what Russia might seek or might not seek to deploy tactical nuclear weapons that get dropped on a battlefield. These are really significant weapons of capability. And supposedly it's driven directly by NATO's concern about the threat from Russia.
It's very interesting because I remember the whole argument at Greenham when, you know, in the 80s when so many, I mean, I was a kid, but, you know, all the peaceniks, the argument was this makes us a target for Russian aggression, when really the Russian aggression should rightly be directed at America. I don't think that argument really stands now because a huge amount of Russian rhetoric against its enemies does come to the UK anyway. I mean, and that has been true since the very first invasion of Ukraine.
Yes.
And it was, you know, there was a kind of underlying hum of any time this did escalate or did try and draw in people beyond Ukraine, the UK would be right in the firing line. So I don't think that's that wouldn't be my first objection, but obviously there is a kind of ongoing objection that every time there's a nuclear escalation, it makes nuclear threats and nuclear language that much more likely.
Here's what I think. I think that whilst it may be that our allies think we ought to have these capabilities on our shores, and I'm open to the discussion about what's required for NATO, I don't think it'll actually happen. I think the most significant thing being asked for here, tucked away in this Telegraph story, is what the US Secretary of the Navy has pointed out, which is that the UK has underinvested in our armed forces, and our defence investment has gone down, and we need to fix that. And I think that if you ask for the moon and then someone says, well, I won't give you the moon, but I'll give you a couple of very small asteroids, which might be the improvement of our defence spending, then you seem reasonable when you come down in your demands. And you say, well, the UK's lifted defence spending to 2.5% and we won't install nuclear weaponry on their facilities. I think that's the compromise that will be sought.
I mean, the bit that is actually really chilling is Sir Patrick Sanders, the head of the army, saying that we're looking towards conscription if we do end up in conflict with Russia.
I think that's the same thing. I think they're not genuinely going to have conscription. It's a call for an improved. We have whittled our armed forces down to the very barest of bones.
Because war seems unthinkable.
Yeah,
the kind of war that we're talking about. The kind of ground war.
Yeah, it does until it happens. And of course, in Ukraine right now, they've been raising the age of conscription upwards and upwards, and Russia still doesn't have one.
I know, but listen, you know, I don't think young men are the way they were last time we had subscription.
And that's a shame.
I don't think it is.
We were meant to talk about the King's Operation Daily Mail. We'll talk about it in the next hour because we've run out of time.